You need to understand something before this story makes sense. The coolers were never a mystery to the men who found them. They understood coolers. What they didn't understand, for 9 years, on the same date, without fail, was why a woman, none of them could name, kept leaving food for men she refused to meet. Picture the gate at 5 in the morning. Frost still on the chain link. 3 coolers lined up like offerings. A thermos wedged between them. Steam still ghosting off the lid, because whoever left it hadn't been gone long. No note, no name, just sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, cut on the diagonal, the way someone's mother used to do it. This happened every March 12th for 9 years. By the 9th year, the men who rode out of that clubhouse, 44 of them, patched and gray and past the age when people expect men like them to still be riding, had stopped joking about it. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over hard men when they sense they are standing near someone else's grief and don't yet have the right to ask about it. This is a story about the year one of them finally asked. It is also a story about a highway and rain and 51 minutes that a woman spent not knowing whether her husband was alive, and a stranger who knelt beside him the whole time and never gave his name. If you've ever loved someone and lost them on a road you can still drive down, if you've ever wondered what the last thing they said actually was, stay until the end of this one. Tell me where you're watching from. And if this story finds you, subscribe, because there are more like it, and they deserve to be found the way this woman finally was. But to understand why 44 grown men stood up at once in a garage that smelled like motor oil and old coffee, you have to go back. Not to the morning she was finally seen, to the morning it started, 9 years earlier, before anyone in that clubhouse knew her face, before they knew there was a debt, before they even knew they'd been the ones who left it unpaid. It begins on a stretch of 2-lane blacktop outside a town most people drive through without slowing down. It begins with rain coming sideways, and a man on his way home from a shift he shouldn't have taken, and a curve in the road that had already claimed 3 other lives before his. It begins, if you want the truth of it, with a stranger who happened to be riding 20 minutes behind him, close enough to see the taillight's fishtail, close enough to reach him before it was too late to matter, and not quite close enough to save him. That night is where all of this comes from. Everything else, the coolers, the silence, the 9 years of a widow walking away before anyone could thank her, is just the echo of those 51 minutes, still moving outward, still looking for somewhere to land. The date was March 12, 2015, and the rain had started at 4 that afternoon, the kind that doesn't announce itself so much as arrive, sheeting sideways off a sky the color of a bruise going old. Route 9 ran through country that had given up trying to be anything but pasture and scrub pine, 40 minutes from town in either direction, no shoulder to speak of, a curve at mile marker 118 that the county had promised to fix for a decade and never had. He was driving a leased Ford with 80,000 miles on it, coming off a double shift at a warehouse that paid him $9 over minimum to move pallets from one end of a concrete floor to the other. He had told his wife he'd be home by 6. He had told her this so many times it had stopped being a promise and become something closer to a fact of the household, as fixed as the mail schedule. 20 minutes behind him, unrelated, uninvolved, riding a bike that had no business being out in that weather and was out in it anyway, was a man in a black vest with wings on the back and a patch that said what patches like that always say: brotherhood, loyalty, something claimed rather than given. He would say later, to no one who asked, that he almost didn't see it, that the taillights ahead of him did something wrong against the rain, a small correction that became a large one, and then there was no road under the car at all, only the idea of a road, and then there was a sound. He stopped. This detail matters more than it seems to. Men on bikes in weather like that do not stop for wrecks that aren't theirs. They call it in from the next town. They keep the throttle steady. They let the professionals handle what professionals are for. He got off the bike in the rain and walked to the car and got the door open with his hands. No tools, just his hands, and whatever strength was in them, and he found a man inside who was still breathing, and still, for a while, still talking. He did not know the man's name yet. He would learn it in the first minute, the way you learn things at the start of an emergency, fast and useless. A name, an address, a wife's name, said the way a man says things he wants someone else to remember in case he can't. The ambulance had been called. The county had one unit covering 40 miles of exactly this kind of road, and it would take 51 minutes to arrive, though no one standing in the rain that night could have told you that number yet. All they had was the waiting, and the sound of it, and a man's hand tightening and loosening in another man's hand, like something trying to hold on to a shape it was losing. The name was Tom. He said it twice. The second time, like he was checking it still worked. And then he said the town he was from. And then he said his wife's name, the way a man drops a stone down a well to hear how deep it goes. He said she made coffee too strong. He said it like a joke that had been told 100 times in a kitchen somewhere, and it came out of him now sideways, between breaths, in the rain, to a stranger in a leather vest who had no way of carrying it anywhere. He told him about the coolers. Not coolers yet. That would come later, years later, though the man kneeling in the road couldn't have known that. What he told him about was simpler than that. A garage. A woman who packed his lunch every morning of their marriage, even after he told her, more than once, that he could pack his own. He said it made her feel like she was still doing something. He said this and then went quiet for a while, and the man kneeling in the road thought that was the end of it, that the well had gone dry, but it hadn't. There was more. There is always more in the last conversation a man has, if someone is patient enough to let him find it. The rain did not let up. It came down through the headlights of the wrecked car at an angle that made it look like static, like something on a television with no signal, and it soaked through both of them without either one seeming to notice. The man kneeling did not check his watch. He would learn later, from someone else, how long it had been. In the moment, there was no minute count, no 51, no 41. Only the sound of a man breathing in a way that had a shape to it, a rhythm that a person who had spent time around dying men could recognize, could not unrecognize once he'd heard it. He kept talking. About a dog they'd had and lost. About a truck he meant to fix. About nothing, really. The small furniture of a life. The things nobody thinks to say out loud until there's a reason to say everything out loud at once. The man kneeling said his own name back to him once, when he asked for it, and Tom repeated it, tried it in his mouth like he wanted to remember it for later, and then he stopped being able to hold on to much of anything for later. The hand in his hand went from tight to loose in a way that had no drama to it, no last gasp, no music, just a kind of quiet arriving where there had been noise. He was still holding it when the ambulance's headlights came around the bend, 51 minutes after the call, and lit up the wet road like something remembering to show up. He never gave a report to anyone, not really. The paramedics took his statement in the clipped, functional language of people who needed facts and not feelings. Time of arrival, position of the body, whether the patient had been conscious. He answered what was asked and nothing more. He did not mention the dog. He did not mention the truck. He did not mention that he had said his own name into a dying man's ear because it seemed like the only thing he had left to give, and that the dying man had taken it and turned it over like a coin before he went quiet. He stood at the edge of the scene afterward, soaked through, his jacket dark with more than rain, and watched the woman being led away from the wreckage by a stranger with a badge, her coat the wrong color for the weather, her mouth moving with questions nobody could yet answer. He did not go to her. He told himself later it was because there was nothing he could say that would not sound like a performance of grief that belonged to someone else. He told himself a few other things too, over the years, none of which held up particularly well under close inspection. By the time the second ambulance arrived for the other driver, a man who would live, who would spend 8 months in physical therapy and never once think about the first man again, the rider had already put his helmet back on. He did this the way men do things they are ashamed of doing quickly, efficient, final, no lingering. He rode the 4 miles back to the clubhouse in weather that should have killed him too, if the road had wanted to make a habit of it that night, and he did not tell anyone what had happened, not that week, not that year. He kept one thing. It had come loose somehow in those last minutes, slipped, or been pressed into his palm on purpose, he was never certain which. A plain gold band gone dull with years of dish soap and engine grease and ordinary marriage. He put it in his jacket pocket that night, meaning to find the widow's address and mail it back with no note attached. He did not do this. Weeks passed, then months. and the not doing of it hardened into something with its own gravity, the way unfinished things do, until it was no longer a task he had failed to complete, but a fact about who he was. He found an old coffee can in the clubhouse kitchen, the kind with a plastic lid and a faded label, and he put the ring inside it, and he put the can in his saddlebag, and there it stayed. Through summers, through the club's slow turnover of prospects and patches, through 9 marches he did not yet know were coming, each one arriving with 3 coolers at the gate and a woman who never asked for a name. He never told anyone about the can. That was the part the narrator found hardest to explain. Later, when people asked how a man could carry a dead stranger's wedding ring for 9 years and let it sit 2 feet from his knee on every ride without once mentioning it. But that was the shape of the man. He was not built for confession. He had come up in a decade when the club still ran hard, when men disappeared for stretches nobody discussed, and came back changed in ways nobody asked about, and the code he'd learned young was simple: you carried what was yours to carry, and you did not make other men carry it with you. So he rode with it. Through Oklahoma dust and Montana sleet, through a divorce nobody at the clubhouse ever heard the details of, through 2 knee surgeries and a heart scare in his late 50s that had him lying on a gurney thinking, absurdly, of a coffee can in a saddlebag in a garage 4 miles away, wondering who would find it if he didn't wake up. He always woke up. He was, by 2016, already gray at the temples, already the kind of member younger prospects called quiet, in a tone that meant they weren't sure what else to call him. He did not seek rank. He did not sit at the head of any table. He fixed carburetors for cash and kept to himself and showed up for every run the chapter made, rain or not, because rain was the one thing that still put him back on that stretch of highway if he let it, and riding through it seemed better than sitting still with it. The first March the sandwiches appeared, he was there. He remembered this later, though at the time it registered as nothing. A woman at the gate, gone before anyone reached her. Coolers left, like an offering nobody had asked for. He ate one of the sandwiches. Turkey, mustard, cut corner to corner. He did not connect it to anything. Why would he? Widows left food at gates for all kinds of reasons, and men who rode with dead friends' names stitched into their vests did not go looking for reasons behind every stranger's grief. He had enough of his own. It was not until the 3rd March, or maybe the 4th, that something in him snagged, some detail in the wrapping, the way the wax paper was folded at precise diagonal creases, military neat, a habit that struck him as familiar in a way he couldn't place and didn't chase. He mentioned it to no one. He ate his sandwich at the picnic table behind the clubhouse, same as always, and he did not once think of a coffee can, and he did not once think of 39 minutes of a man talking through blood in his throat about his wife's garden, her chickens, the fence he still hadn't finished. That thought would come later, much later, and when it did, it would arrive all at once, the way floodwater arrives, not gradually, but as a wall. The narrator, the one telling this now, was not there for that 4th March. He has to say that plainly, because a story like this collects false witnesses the way a windshield collects bugs on a summer highway, everyone claiming they saw it happen exactly the way they wanted it to have happened. He was told about the wax paper years later, by a man who no longer folds anything precisely, whose hands shake now from something that is not fear and not cold. But he believes it. He believes it because grief, real grief, does not announce itself. It hides inside habits. It hides inside the crease of a sandwich wrapper, the same fold made 9 years running by a woman who did not know she was making it, who probably could not have told you why she folded it that way if you had asked her, because some hands remember things the mind has agreed to forget. By the 5th March, the coolers had become a fixture. Nobody spoke of it as strange anymore. New prospects, patched in during those years, were simply told, "There's coolers at the gate every March 12th, don't touch them till noon, don't chase the woman, don't ask questions." It became procedure. It became, in the flattening way that ritual flattens everything, almost boring, the kind of thing a man stops seeing because he has seen it too many times, the way you stop seeing your own front door. The president before Rooster, a heavy-set man everyone called Deacon, kept a ledger of sorts. Not written down, nothing so formal, just a running count he'd announce at the March cookout. half joke, half tribute. 40 sandwiches this year, boys. Somebody go find who's not eating. Nobody thought to count differently. Nobody thought to ask what 40 sandwiches, made by the same hands, folded the same way, delivered on the same date for the same reason, might actually mean, arithmetic-wise, over a run of years. 300, give or take, by the time Rooster took the gavel. Nobody had added it up. It takes distance to add a thing like that up. It takes someone outside the routine, someone new enough not to have gone numb to it. That someone would turn out to be Rooster himself, and it would not happen because he was smarter than the men before him. It would happen because of a single afternoon in February of 2024, 3 weeks before the 9th drop, when a woman in a gray coat walked past the clubhouse gate on a day that was not March 12th at all, and did not stop, and did not look at it, the way a person does not look at a grave they pass on purpose most days of the year, and only visit on the one day they've decided to let themselves feel it. He noted this the way he noted everything, which was, without comment, filing it in the back of his skull next to the other unexplained things a man collects over 3 decades on a bike, the exact sound a deer makes before it breaks from the tree line, the particular stillness of a highway 10 seconds before something goes wrong on it. He did not mention the woman in the gray coat to anyone that week. He was not yet a man who followed people. He was, at that point, still only a man who noticed them. But noticing, once it starts, does not stop on command. He found himself, over the following days, doing the arithmetic the others had never bothered with. 3 coolers a year. Call it 33 sandwiches to a cooler. 99 to a drop. 9 drops. He did the multiplication twice, on the back of a fuel receipt, because the first number seemed wrong, too large for something that had always felt, in the club's collective memory, like a small and private courtesy. 891. He sat with that number, the way a man sits with a diagnosis. It did not match the story the chapter had been telling itself, which was of a kind stranger, a one-time gesture that had simply repeated out of habit or superstition. Habits do not survive 9 years without will behind them. This was not habit. This was maintenance. Somebody was tending something, the way you tend a grave, the way you keep a flame lit in a window for a man who is not coming back but whom you have decided, on principle, not to let go dark. He asked around, carefully, the way you ask about a debt nobody wants to admit owing. Nobody had a name. Nobody had a description beyond gray coat, gray hair, quick walk, gone before the door opened. One of the older members, a patch holder who'd been with the chapter since the Reagan years, said only that she'd been coming since before his knees went bad, which put it somewhere in the range everyone already suspected, and added nothing. Rooster went to the ledger the club kept, dues, repairs, the small architecture of a clubhouse's finances, and found, tucked behind a rain-warped invoice from a defunct auto parts supplier, 3 index cards in a dead treasurer's handwriting, each one dated March 12th of a different year, each one reading, in full, sandwiches, coffee, woman, unknown. Nothing more. 3 separate men, across 9 years, had stood at that gate and written down almost the exact same 4 words, as if the fact defied elaboration, as if language simply ran out at the edge of it. He put the cards in his jacket pocket and did not take them out again until the following March, 3 weeks out, when the air over Steel Ridge went sharp and metallic the way it does before a cold front, and the calendar on the clubhouse wall turned, without ceremony, to the 12th. He did not sleep well that week, though he would not have called it that if asked, would have said instead that he'd been up late with chapter business, which was not exactly a lie. He kept the 3 index cards clipped together with a binder clip meant for receipts, and looked at them the way a man looks at a diagnosis he hasn't fully accepted. Sandwiches, coffee, woman, unknown. 3 treasurers, 3 different sets of handwriting, 1 dead of a heart attack in a Denny's parking lot, 1 moved to Arizona and unreachable, 1 still around but retired from the books entirely, and all 3 had reached for the same word, unknown, not stranger, not visitor, unknown, like something that resisted classification on purpose. He asked around the chapter, carefully, without making it sound like the thing it had become in his chest. Nobody had followed her. Nobody had asked her name. A woman in a gray coat left food at their gate on the same date every year, and they had eaten it, thanked an empty street, and gone back inside 9 times running, and it had taken him, the president, the man whose job was supposed to be noticing things, 9 years to think it was strange enough to chase. He found himself doing the math without meaning to. March 12th. He turned the date over the way you turn over a stone you suspect has something living under it, and got nowhere, because the club had no institutional memory of a March 12th that mattered. No run, no funeral, no anniversary anyone could name. Whatever the date meant, it meant it to her, not to them. That asymmetry sat wrong in him, the way an unlatched gate sits wrong in a man who's spent his life on watch. 3 weeks. The cold front came in exactly as the older members had promised it would, dropping the nights below freezing, turning the gravel lot to iron underfoot, and he found himself, more than once, standing at the gate at dusk, for no reason he gave himself, looking down the street she was said to have gone, 4 blocks in a direction that led, eventually, to a scatter of duplexes with dead lawns and vinyl siding gone the color of old teeth. He had not gone that far yet. He told himself the timing wasn't right, that she came at a set hour and left before 9, that ambushing her would spook her worse than 9 years of silence ever had. He was aware, dimly, that he was building himself a reason to wait, the way men do when they are afraid of what they'll owe once they know. The calendar turned to the 9th, then the 10th. Somewhere in a saddlebag 2 rows down from where he slept, a coffee can sat undisturbed, as it had sat undisturbed for 9 winters, and neither man knew yet how close the distance between them had gotten. The 11th came gray and still, the kind of morning that seemed to be holding its breath along with everyone else. He woke before his alarm, which he never did, and lay in his bunk listening to the furnace tick in the walls, and by the time he swung his legs down he had already decided something, without deciding it, the way a man notices he has already turned the wheel before he remembers meaning to. He didn't tell anyone. That was its own kind of decision. He'd learned, in 30 years of running a chapter, that the surest way to ruin a fragile thing was to bring 6 opinions to it before it had a chance to breathe. So he ate breakfast standing at the counter, and he checked the ledger like it was any other Tuesday, and he let the day pass around him the way weather passes around a fence post. Noticed, endured, ignored. At 4 he told the prospect manning the gate to take the evening off. At 6 he told himself it wasn't about surveillance. It was about being present, for once, instead of absent at the exact hour that mattered. He'd spent 9 years being absent at that hour without knowing it, and there was something in that fact that sat on his chest at night, worse than any war memory. He waited in the shadow of the equipment shed, out of the wind, watching his own breath go white and vanish. The temperature had dropped again, the ground hard enough that his boots made a sound like knuckles on a door. Somewhere past 7:30, a dog barked twice down the block and went quiet. The streetlight at the corner buzzed and steadied. She came at 7:52, same as always, same gray coat, same steady, unhurried walk that gave nothing away, carrying 2 coolers this time instead of 3. The strap of the thermos crossed over one shoulder like a rifle sling. She set them at the gate without breaking stride, the way a woman sets down a thing she has set down so many times her hands no longer need her attention for it, and she straightened, and for one moment, just one, she looked toward the shed. He didn't move. He wasn't sure she'd seen him. He told himself, later, that she hadn't, that it was only the wind moving his jacket, only a trick of the dark. But something in the set of her shoulders changed before she turned, some fraction of a hesitation that hadn't been there in 9 years of marches, and it was that fraction, not the coolers, not the thermos, not even the date circled red on his calendar, that put his boots in motion before his mind caught up to them. He followed her at 40 yards, keeping to the far side of the street, matching his stride to the rhythm of hers, and somewhere behind him, unheard, unseen, an old coffee can shifted an inch in a saddlebag as the wind found its way through a gap in the shed door. She turned left at the boarded pharmacy, then right at the corner where the stoplight had blinked yellow for as long as anyone could remember, and he kept the 40 yards behind her, past the laundromat with its one working dryer, past a church whose sign still advertised a soup kitchen that had closed the winter before. The town at that hour belonged to nobody. A dog barked twice behind a chain-link fence and quit. Somewhere a screen door slapped shut, She did not look back again, and he understood, walking it, that she wasn't afraid of being followed. She had simply never imagined that anyone would. 4 blocks. He counted them without meaning to, the way he counted mile markers on long runs, a habit left over from another life where distance meant something you had to account for later. First block, a row of duplexes with plywood in half the windows. Second, a lot where a gas station used to be, the pumps gone, the concrete island still standing like a headstone for a business nobody mourned. Third, a stretch of chain link and weeds where a swing set rusted, chains but no seats. Fourth block, and she slowed. The house she stopped at was the kind that didn't ask to be noticed. Vinyl siding gone the color of old teeth, a chain link gate hanging on one hinge, a lawn that hadn't been green in a season that anyone could name. There was a light on in one window, low and yellow, the kind of light that comes from a single lamp in a single room, and nowhere else. She went up the 2 concrete steps without looking at her own front door the way most people do, without that small pause of homecoming, and let herself in, and the door closed, and the porch light did not come on because there wasn't one to turn on. He stood across the street, in the shadow of somebody's dead maple, and did not move for a long time. He told himself he was only confirming an address, the kind of thing a man does out of habit, out of the same instinct that made him check locks twice and count exits in every room he entered. But he knew, standing there, that it was more than that. 9 years of marches had a shape to them now, a shape he could almost see, the way you can sometimes see the outline of a fish just under the surface of dark water, not the fish itself, only the disturbance it makes moving through. The window light did not go out. He watched it for what felt like a long while, though when he checked his watch after it had only been 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes he decided nothing and everything, the way men his age decide most of the things that matter, quietly, without ceremony, already moving before the decision has fully arrived. He crossed the street. The porch boards gave under his weight with a sound like something exhaling. He stood at the door for a moment before he knocked, and when he did it the way he'd learned to knock on doors overseas, 3 times, not loud, the kind of knock that says, "I am not leaving, and I am not a threat," both at once, if a man can manage both at once with his knuckles. Nothing moved inside for 11 seconds. He counted them. Then the deadbolt turned, and the door opened only as far as the chain allowed, and one eye and a slice of gray coat looked out at him through the gap. "You followed me." It wasn't a question, and she didn't sound frightened. She sounded like a woman confirming something she'd already suspected for longer than he'd been standing there. "I did," he said. "I'm sorry for it." "No, you're not." He almost smiled. He didn't. "No," he admitted, "I'm not." The chain stayed on. Through the gap, he could see a sliver of the room behind her, a single lamp, a couch with a folded blanket squared on its arm, like something arranged for inspection rather than comfort, and on the wall opposite the window, angled just so, a framed photograph. He couldn't make out the face from where he stood, only the shape of a man's shoulders and the corner of a smile, but he understood immediately that it was the only frame in the room, possibly the only frame in the house, and that a woman who owned exactly one photograph did not put it up carelessly. "You're the one from the gate," she said. "The one who runs it." "Rooster," he said, because it was the only name that had meant anything to him in 20 years, and because for reasons he couldn't have explained, standing on a stranger's porch in the dark, giving her his real name, felt like it would have been the smaller offering. She studied him through the gap the way a woman studies a stranger's hands before she decides whether to shake one, not suspicious exactly, just thorough, the way people get after the world has taught them that thoroughness is the only insurance available to them. 9 years, she said, and you've never once come to say thank you, or ask why. I'm asking now. The eye in the gap held on him a moment longer. Somewhere behind her, a radiator ticked as it cooled. She did not answer right away, and he found he did not mind the waiting. He had spent a career learning that the truth, when it finally moved slow and low to the ground, the way smoke does before a fire shows itself. "It's cold on this porch," she finally said. "You want to come in, or you want to stand there catching your death?" The chain slid back before he answered. The living room was smaller than the porch had promised, the kind of small that comes from a life pared down to its essentials, and then pared down again. A couch with a folded blanket at one end, a television that looked unused, and on the wall above a chair that had clearly not been sat in for some time, a single framed photograph, a man in a canvas jacket, squinting against sun, laughing at something outside the frame, some joke the camera would never know. He did not ask. He had learned that much, at least, in 20 years of standing over things that could not be undone, that a man does not point at another man's grief and demand it explain itself. She saw him looking anyway. "That's Tom," she said, and there was no tremor in it, only the flat, practiced calm of a fact repeated so many times it had worn smooth, like a coin carried in a pocket for years. 9 years in April. He nodded. He did not trust his voice yet to do anything but betray him. She moved to the kitchen, and he heard the particular domestic sounds of a woman who had made coffee for one person for a very long time, the cabinet that stuck, the water running longer than it needed to, the small metallic complaint of an old percolator being asked, again, to do its one job. He stood where he was, because it did not feel like a house that wanted to be wandered. "Sit," she said, from the other room, not unkindly. "You're not going to break anything standing there, but you might as well not loom." He sat. The chair across from him, not the one below the photograph, he noticed, never that one, held the shape of someone who used it often, and he understood, in the way a man understands weather before it arrives, that this was where she sat each night, alone, with the coffee she made from habit rather than need. When she came back with 2 mugs, she set one in front of him without asking whether he wanted it, and he understood that this, too, was a form of the same offering she had been making at the gate for 9 years. Food given before it was requested, care extended past the point where thanks could interrupt it. "You didn't come here to eat sandwiches," she said, sitting. "No, ma'am. You came because you finally wanted to know why a woman keeps feeding 40 grown men who never asked her name." He turned the mug slowly in his hands, feeling the heat move into the old scar tissue across his knuckles, and said nothing, because the truth had not finished moving yet, and he had learned a long time ago not to rush it before it showed its face. She waited him out. He had known men in interrogation rooms who couldn't do what she did in that kitchen, sit inside a silence without filling it, without flinching, without reaching for the nearest available word, just to end the discomfort of not speaking. She had learned patience somewhere he hadn't asked about yet, and he suspected the answer to that, too, would come from the same year everything else had come from. 9 years, he finally said. That's a long time to feed strangers. They stopped being strangers around year 3. She wrapped both hands around her mug, the way a person does when the temperature outside has nothing to do with why they need the warmth. I just never told them that. Why not? Because the day I tell them, it becomes a story. And once it's a story, people start looking at me different. Sorry eyes. I've had 9 years of sorry eyes from everyone else in this town. I didn't want it from the one place that didn't know to give it to me. He thought about that longer than he meant to. 44 men who nodded to her at the gate like she was furniture, like she was weather, and how that anonymity had been the gift, not the wound. Your husband, he said. It wasn't a question. He watched it land on her, the way a name lands on someone who has spent 9 years waiting to hear it, asked correctly, by the right person, in the right kitchen. Tom, she said, and the word came out steadier than he expected, like she'd built a shelf for it a long time ago and set it there every day since. March 12th, 2015. He kept his face still. It was a discipline he'd built over 4 decades, the same one that let him sit a bike through gunfire in another country and not let his hands shake on the throttle, and he used every year of it now, because something in him had already started counting backward, already lining her date up against a date he carried in his own chest like a second heartbeat, and he did not yet let it show. Route 9, she said. They told me it was raining. They told me a man stopped. She looked at him then, not at his face, but past it, at some fixed point on the wall that wasn't the photograph. Nobody ever told me his name. The mug was still warm in his hands. He set it down carefully, The way a man sets down something he suddenly understands he cannot afford to drop, and he said the only true thing he had. Tell me what they did tell you. She told him what they told her, and it was not much, and she told it the way people tell things they have worn smooth from handling. A trucker had called it in. A man in a leather vest had been the first one out of a vehicle, had gone down on both knees in the wet gravel of the shoulder without checking his own jeans for the water first, had stayed there the whole time. The county report, when she'd finally gotten a copy 11 months later because no one had thought to give it to her sooner, listed a civilian bystander, unidentified, departed scene prior to law enforcement arrival. That was the entire sentence. Departed scene prior to law enforcement arrival, as if a man who held another man's hand for the better part of an hour had simply misplaced himself, had wandered off like weather. He listened with his forearms on his knees, and he did not ask the questions crowding up behind his teeth, because he had learned a long time ago in a much worse country that the questions could wait and the listening could not. He talked to him, she said. That's the part I keep. Somebody at the hospital. A nurse, maybe. I don't remember her face anymore. She told me the man talked to Tom the whole time. Not just held his hand. Talked. Like they were old friends waiting on a table at a diner. Her hands were folded so tightly in her lap that the knuckles had gone the color of the wall behind her. I used to think if I ever found him, I'd ask what they talked about. Now I think I'd just ask if Tom was scared. That's all. Just that. The room had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight to it, that presses on the ears. Somewhere outside a dog barked twice and stopped. He was aware of his own pulse in a way he usually was not, a slow, hard knock against his sternum, and he understood with the flat certainty of a man reading a road sign that he was sitting 4 feet from a question he had spent 9 years arranging his whole life around not answering. He did not answer it now either. That was its own kind of cowardice, and he knew it, even as he chose it, filed it away, next to the coffee can in his saddlebag, and all the years he had told himself the timing was never right, the woman never ready, the wound never far enough behind her. You should come by the clubhouse, he heard himself say instead, and it surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. Not to ask anything, just to sit. She looked at him for a long moment, the way a person looks at a door they have been told is unlocked, and still do not quite believe. I don't know how, she said. I do, he said. That's the whole job. The narrator, telling this now from a distance of years, has always found it strange how much of a man's whole character can live inside the shape of a single offer. Not to ask anything, just to sit. He had built a career, a reputation, 40-some years of riding and burying and standing over open graves in the wind, on the principle of not needing more than that from anyone. And here he was extending it to a woman he had lied to by omission for 9 years running, as if silence could be repaid with silence's opposite, a chair, a plate, the low murmur of a room that did not require her to explain herself. She said she would think about it. He said that was fine. He drove home slower than usual that night, headlights catching the frost starting to silver the ditch grass, and he did not go looking for the coffee can when he got in. He knew exactly where it was. He always knew exactly where it was. What the narrator remembers most from what he was told about that week afterward is not the visit itself, but what happened at the clubhouse 2 days later, when word had gotten around, the way word does in a chapter, sideways and quiet, nobody saying it straight out, but everybody somehow arriving at the same fact by Thursday, that the widow who left the coolers had a face now, a name, an address 4 blocks off Route 9. Some of the older members went still when they heard it. A couple of the younger ones asked questions nobody answered, and one man, gray-bearded, quieter than the rest even by the standards of a room built on quiet, sat with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he wasn't drinking from, and said nothing at all, which itself was its own kind of confession if anyone had known to read it. Nobody did. Not yet. The president did not push it. That was not how it worked in that chapter. Not with a man who had ridden with them for as long as anyone could remember, and never once asked for anything, never once explained the coffee can that lived in his saddlebag like a second heart nobody was permitted to examine. There were things you let a man carry in his own time, and things you pried loose, and the difference between them was usually a matter of watching his hands. So the president watched, and waited, and 4 days later, On a morning cold enough that the flag outside the clubhouse hung stiff instead of moving, a car he did not recognize pulled slow along the gravel drive, hesitated at the gate, the way a person hesitates at the edge of water they are not sure will hold their weight, and did not turn around. The car sat at the gate for 11 minutes. He knew it was 11 because he timed it, the way he timed most things now, a habit left over from a life that had taught him seconds mattered more than people admitted. He did not walk out. He stood at the window of the clubhouse with his arms folded and watched the shape behind the windshield, blurred by frost and distance, and he thought, not yet. She had come every year on the same date, and never once on any other. This was not that date. This was 4 days after, which meant something had shifted, some balance tipped, and a woman who had spent 9 years perfecting the art of not being seen was now sitting in a car in plain daylight, deciding whether to be seen at all. The door did not open. The engine did not cut. After 11 minutes, the car reversed slowly, careful on the gravel, and pulled back onto the road the way it had come. He exhaled. He had not realized he was holding it. Behind him, the man with the coffee cup had come to stand at the second window, the one further down, and he was looking at the same stretch of empty road with an expression that belonged less to a 60-year-old biker than to a much younger man watching something walk away from him for the second time in his life. "That her?" the president asked, though he already knew. The man didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had the flatness of something said, only because silence had become worse than speaking. "That's the car," he said, "not hers. Her neighbor's, maybe. She doesn't drive since it happened. Never got it fixed in her head, I'd guess. You know that how." Nothing. The coffee cup again, both hands around it, no drinking. The president let it sit. He had built a life on knowing which silences to fill and which to leave alone, and this one, he understood now, was load-bearing. Pull one thread, and something structural would come down, something that had been holding for 9 years and needed to be taken apart slow, with care, the way you'd disarm a thing rather than break it. Outside, the flag had gone still again, the wind dying the way it did in that country before a change came through. 4 days, the president said. She's never come outside her day, not once in 9 years. No, something's different. The man set the cup down on the sill, finally, both hands free, and for a moment the president thought he might speak the whole of it right there, standing at a window with frost still webbed across the glass. Instead, he said only, "She followed you home. Now maybe she thinks you'll follow her back." Then he walked out of the room, boots quiet on the concrete, and left the president standing there, with the cold coming through the glass, and the sense, sharp and sudden, that the next visitor to that gate would not be turning around. The president stood a long while after the door closed, listening to the buildings settle around him the way old buildings do in cold weather, ticking and contracting, the pipes knocking somewhere below the floor. He thought about the word the man had used, followed, as if the widow had been the one doing the tracking all along, and he'd only just now caught up to what she'd already known. He went back to his office and pulled the calendar off the wall, the one with the greasy thumbprints on every march, 9 years of them stacked one behind the other like sediment. He laid it flat on the desk and looked at it the way he'd look at a map before a long ride, tracing the dates with one finger, feeling for the pattern he'd missed by being too close to it. 9 years of the same morning. 9 years of coolers left at the same hour, in the same spot, by a woman who never once climbed the 3 steps to the gate to see if anyone was watching. He had always assumed that was shyness. Now he wasn't sure it wasn't something closer to penance, or maybe just the private arithmetic of grief, a woman balancing a ledger only she could read. He thought about the ring, not what it meant. He still didn't have the shape of that yet, but the fact of its existence, small and gold and kept, riding in a saddlebag through 9 winters of salt and road grime, through summers hot enough to warp the leather around it. A man did not carry a thing that long by accident. A man carried a thing that long because putting it down felt like a second kind of dying. He folded the calendar back along its creases and set it in the bottom drawer, out of sight, though he suspected he would take it out again before the week was through. Outside, the temperature had dropped another degree. He could feel it in the way the window glass sweated on the inside now, a thin fog blooming and receding with the furnace cycling on and off. He thought of the duplex 4 blocks east, the dead lawn, the single photograph on the wall, and wondered if she was standing at her own window right now, looking back toward the clubhouse the way he was looking toward her street. 2 people in 2 houses separated by 4 blocks and 9 years, each one waiting for the other to make the next move. He picked up the phone on his desk, an old landline nobody used anymore, and dialed the number scrawled on the back of a receipt in his coat pocket, the number the man with the coffee can had given him without being asked, said quietly, like a confession he'd been rehearsing. It rang twice. Then a voice, cautious, feminine, worn thin at the edges, said, "Hello?" He didn't answer right away. He was still deciding how much of the truth a person could hold in one sitting. "Rooster," he said finally, because that was the only thing he trusted himself to say without stumbling into something bigger. From the clubhouse, silence on the line, not empty, just careful. He could hear a radio somewhere behind her, low, tuned to a station that played nothing but weather and grain prices, the kind of station a person leaves on for company rather than information. "I know who you are," she said. He hadn't expected that, and it cost him a second before he answered. "I wanted to ask if you'd come by Saturday, not to drop anything off, just come by." Another silence, longer this time. He pictured her standing in that duplex with the phone cord stretched to its limit, the way older people still did even with cordless models sitting unused in a drawer somewhere, out of habit, out of a belief that some conversations required tethering yourself to one spot. "Why?" she said. Not a question, really. A test. He looked at the coffee can on his desk, the lid slightly rusted at the seam, and thought about the man who'd carried it on every ride for 9 years without knowing what to do with what was inside it. He thought about 41 minutes he hadn't earned the right to describe to her over a telephone line, in a kitchen, standing up. "Because there's somebody here who's been waiting a long time to talk to you," he said, "and I think you've been waiting too. You just didn't know who for." The radio hummed behind her. Outside his own window, the fog kept gathering and clearing on the glass, keeping time with the furnace, and he found himself matching his breathing to it without meaning to, the way a man does when he's trying not to say too much too fast. "Saturday," she repeated, testing the word the way she might test ice on a step before putting her weight on it. "Saturday," he said. "Afternoon. No hurry before then." She didn't agree. She didn't refuse either. What she did was exhale, slow, audible even through the receiver, a sound he recognized because he'd made it himself more than once in the last 9 years. Standing at that gate, with an empty cooler in his hands, listening to footsteps recede down a street he'd never once had the nerve to walk. "All right," she said finally. "Saturday." The line went dead before he could say anything else, and he sat there holding the receiver a moment longer than he needed to, the dial tone flat and steady in his ear, thinking that some doors don't open all at once. They ease, degree by degree, the way that window fogged and cleared, keeping its own private, patient time. He hung up the phone and sat in the kitchen for a while, without turning on another light, letting the dark settle around the one bulb over the stove the way it settled over most of his evenings now. 44 men, and he was the one who'd made the call, and he still didn't know how he'd say it when Saturday came, how you tell a room full of patched riders that the woman who'd fed them for 9 years without a name was standing in the doorway, and that one of them had been carrying a dead man's ring in a coffee can the whole time. He thought about telling Dutch first, pulling him aside, quiet, the way you'd tell a man his mother had passed, gentle, private, room to fall apart if he needed to. But he also knew Dutch would see it coming the second she walked in. Some things a man carries long enough, he starts listening for the sound of them landing. He didn't sleep well. He hadn't most nights that week, waking at 3 and 4, with the ceiling fan ticking overhead, and his mind running the same 4 blocks over and over, her coat, her porch light, the framed photograph leaning slightly crooked on its nail. He kept coming back to that crookedness, 9 years of coming and going through that house, and she'd never once straightened it. He understood that now, in a way he hadn't at the door. Some things you don't fix, because fixing them would mean admitting you'd noticed they were broken. Friday he went to the clubhouse early, before anyone else, and sat in the folding chair nearest the gate, the exact spot the Coolers had sat every March for 9 years, like he could learn something from the concrete itself. The gravel was cold under his boots. Somewhere down the road a truck downshifted, faded, was gone. He thought about the 51 minutes, about the 41 Dutch had never once mentioned to a living soul, not even after 3 beers and a bad week, not even the year his own father died and grief made men say things they usually kept buried. He wondered what a man carried out of a highway like that, whether it sat in the chest like a stone or moved around, restless, looking for somewhere to be set down. By the time the others started arriving Saturday morning, cutting engines in 2s and 3s along the fence line, he still hadn't decided how he'd say her name to the room. He only knew that when her car turned onto the gravel, slow, tentative, the same gray coat visible through the windshield, 44 men would be standing before she ever got the door open, and none of them, including him, would know quite how to hold still for what came next. Her car came up the gravel at a walking pace, as if some part of her already sensed the number of men waiting on the other side of the fence and was giving herself time to turn around. She didn't. The tires crunched to a stop a few feet from the gate, and for a long moment nothing moved. Not the engine, not the men, not the flag hanging slack on its pole in the windless morning. Rooster stepped forward first. He opened her door the way he might have opened it for his own mother, and she looked up at him with an expression that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite gratitude, something suspended between the two. "They're waiting on you," he said. Waiting for what? He didn't answer that. He only offered his arm, and after a moment she took it, and together they walked through the gate into a lot gone silent, except for the sound of her shoes on the gravel. The 44 of them had arranged themselves without discussing it, a loose half-circle facing the entrance, the younger patches toward the back, the older ones up front where their faces could be seen clearly. When she came through the gate, they stood straighter, though most of them were already standing. It was less an action than a held breath made visible. She stopped a few feet inside, coat buttoned to the throat despite the morning warming around them, and looked at the rows of leather and gray beards and faded ink like a woman reading a language she'd never been taught, but somehow understood the shape of. "I only ever wanted to leave the Coolers," she said, "to no one and everyone. I didn't come here for this." "We know," Rooster said. "Then why?" He didn't finish the thought for her. He only nodded toward the picnic tables someone had dragged into rows the night before, toward the smell of the grill already going in the corner of the lot, toward the door of the garage propped open behind them where folding chairs waited in a loose circle, as if the whole club had spent the last 2 days building a place for a conversation none of them had ever had. Somewhere near the back, a man in a faded vest hadn't stood with the rest right away. He'd risen a beat late, slower than the others, one hand resting on the strap of a saddlebag slung over his shoulder, an old habit, or maybe just weight he didn't trust to set down yet. He watched her from where he stood, saying nothing, doing nothing, the way a man watches weather he has been waiting 9 years to see arrive. He had the coffee can already in his hand before anyone told him to move. Nobody had told him anything. That was the part the narrator, years later, would keep coming back to when he tried to explain it to someone who hadn't been there. How the man in the back didn't wait for Rooster's nod, didn't look around to see if it was his turn, just started walking, the can held against his ribs like something that might spill if he wasn't careful, though there was nothing in it that could spill anymore. The rows of picnic tables went quiet in sections, the way a crowd does when it senses something moving through it before it can see what. She didn't recognize him. 9 years is a long time to hold a face you saw for less than an hour. In the rain, at the worst hour of your life, when you weren't looking at faces at all but at hands. His hands, on her husband's chest, on her husband's arm, on the wet asphalt bracing them both. He stopped a few feet from her and didn't speak right away. He set the can down on the corner of the nearest table, the metal making a small sound against the wood, and worked the lid loose with a thumb gone stiff at the knuckle from 30 years of gripping handlebars in every kind of weather. "I should have come to you a long time ago," he said. "I didn't know how." She looked at the can. She looked at him. Something in her face was doing arithmetic it didn't want to finish. He reached in and came out with a ring, plain gold, scuffed dull along one edge, and held it out on his open palm, the way a man holds something he isn't sure he's allowed to still be carrying. The sound she made wasn't a word. Rooster, standing off to the side where he'd been standing all morning, felt the whole lot go still around that one small object. 44 men who talked over engines and gunfire and each other's worst stories, and not one of them said anything at all. She took the ring with both hands, the way you'd take something from underwater. "You were there," she said, not a question. "I never left," he said. "I just never told you I stayed." Somewhere behind them the grill popped and hissed, indifferent, and the smell of meat and smoke drifted low across the gravel, and for a moment it was the only ordinary thing happening in that lot, the rest of it suspended, waiting, the way a held breath waits before it decides whether to become a sob or something quieter than that. It became something quieter than that. She lowered herself onto the folding chair someone had pushed forward without ceremony, and the man who had knelt in the road lowered himself onto the one across from her, and for a while neither of them ate. The paper plates sat between them collecting grease in silence while 44 men found reasons to be elsewhere, checking bikes that didn't need checking, refilling drinks that were already full, the particular tact of men who have learned, usually the hard way, when a room needs emptying without anyone actually leaving it. He told her about the 41 minutes. Not all at once. He gave it to her the way he'd carried it, in pieces worn smooth from handling. How her husband had asked, twice, whether the other driver was hurt, before asking about himself. How he'd talked about a fence that needed mending on the north side of a property she recognized before he finished the sentence. How, near the end, when the words had gotten harder to find, he'd said her name 3 times in a row like a man checking that a door was still locked. She sat with her hands around the ring and did not interrupt him once. When he got to the part about the rain finally slowing, and the sound of the ambulance still 4 minutes out, his voice did something it hadn't done in 9 years of keeping this to himself. It broke, just slightly, on the word ambulance. And he stopped and looked at his own hands like he was surprised to find them empty now that the ring had left them. "I should have found you after," he said. "I told myself it wasn't mine to give. That's not true. I just didn't know how to walk up to a woman's door and hand her the worst 40 minutes of her life along with the ring." 51, she said quietly. He looked up. "They told me it was 51 minutes, she said. "I've never been sure where you stopped being part of that number and the ambulance started. I stayed till they took him," he said. "All of it." She nodded, once, and pressed the ring flat against her palm like she was checking it was real, and somewhere behind them a man laughed low at something that had nothing to do with any of this, and the grill popped again, and the wind moved through the gravel lot carrying the smell of char and coffee and machine oil, ordinary smells, the smells of a place that fed people, and she looked up at the clubhouse door standing open behind him and asked, in a voice gone almost steady, whether this was where they always ate. Rooster said yes, mostly, and told her about the times it wasn't. The funerals, the rides in from 3 states over, the winters when the grill stayed cold and they ate inside standing up because the tables were still wet with melt. He told her the coolers had become part of the answer to that question without anyone deciding it should be. She listened the way she'd learned to listen to a man talking about her husband's last minutes, still, without interrupting, filing each detail somewhere she could find it later. The man who had knelt in the road pulled 2 folding chairs from against the wall and set them at the table across from each other, not side by side, so that when they sat down, they were facing one another, the way people do when they intend to actually finish a conversation. He didn't sit until she did. Old habit, maybe, or something newer, learned in the 9 years since he'd been the last person to hold her husband's hand. He talked most of it, he said. First 20 minutes he was scared. I won't pretend he wasn't, then he wasn't anymore. She didn't ask why. She waited, and that waiting was its own kind of question, and he answered it without being asked. He talked about you, he said. The whole rest of the time. Not the accident, not the truck. You. Her hand closed around the ring. He said your name maybe 40 times, he said. I counted, after. Not right then. After, when I couldn't stop hearing it. Somewhere behind them a cooler lid banged shut, and a younger rider called out that the second batch was ready, and nobody at the table moved, because none of that had reached them yet, None of it had made it across the 8 feet of gravel and folding table where an old debt was finally being paid and the only currency either of them had left. "I have wanted that word for 9 years," she said, "and I didn't know it was missing." He didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have cheapened it, and he seemed to know it, the way a man who has spent decades learning what not to say around grief usually does. He just sat with his forearms on the table, hands loosely folded, the coffee can gone from between them now, the ring gone from the can, the years gone from wherever they'd been stored, and let her have the silence for as long as she needed it, which turned out to be a long time, though no one at Steel Ridge that afternoon would ever have called it wasted. That was the spring the club voted, unanimous, 44 hands, to make the 12th of March a standing thing, not a wake, nobody wanted to call it that, just a ride out to the bend on Route 9 in the morning, quiet, engines low, and then back to the clubhouse for a cookout that ran till dark. They put a folding chair at the head of the long table, and nobody sat in it. Not that year, not any year after. It was hers. She came every time. Gray coat traded eventually for a lighter one, then no coat at all, in the years the March weather turned kind, and she brought sandwiches still, though now she made them in the clubhouse kitchen instead of her own, surrounded by men who called her by name and meant it. I was 26 that first spring, patched in 8 months, and I didn't understand yet what I was watching. I thought it was a nice thing that happened once, the kind of story you tell because it has a clean shape to it, the ring, the can, the 41 minutes. It took me years to understand it wasn't a story about a ring at all. She died in the winter of 2031, in her sleep, in the same duplex, though by then the lawn wasn't dead anymore because somebody from the chapter mowed it every week without being asked. We buried her near him. Rooster read something short. Dutch didn't speak, but he was the one who filled in the ground with a shovel afterward, which nobody thought was strange, because nobody it belonged more to. I think about the coolers more than I think about the ring, if I'm honest. 3 of them, every year, for 9 years, before any of us knew her name, or hers knew ours. There's no ceremony in a sandwich. There's no grand gesture in wax paper and a thermos lid. But she made 300 of those over 9 years and never once asked to be thanked, and I have come to believe that's the truest form grief takes when it has nowhere else to go. Not a monument, not a eulogy, just food left quietly at a gate for men who once knelt in the rain for somebody she loved. We still ride out every March. 44 became 61, became something else entirely. The numbers shift, the way they do. But the chair stays at the head of the table, empty now, in a different way than it used to be, and every year somebody makes the sandwiches, because that's the part of her we decide